All right, I think we're on round 3 now of Where in the World is Your Friendly Neighborhood Book Bro. If you're watching on YouTube, we've got an incredibly killer setup out here. I mentioned on Tuesday, if you can figure out where I am, you'll get, I don't know, some sort of prize that I get to decide on after the fact. But write into me, let me know where you think I am while we do another episode of Words, Words, Words. So on Tuesday, next Tuesday, I'll let you guys know where I am, in fact. But this is this awesome new studio setup that I've got. You can see where I am. It's sort of like I've been transported into some kind of neoclassical mansion, like I'm in Andrew Jackson's country estate or something like that. That is not, in fact, where I am, but it looks almost as if that's what's going on. Or honestly, it looks as a little bit like I've finally come home at last to Ithaca. If you've been following the Odyssey episodes, that's where Odysseus is now. He's arriving at last in his home. And I got these awesome paintings behind me of people in what looks like, I think it's Greek, meant to be sort of maybe Spartan garb or something like that. There are bearded philosophers wandering idyllically among the columns. There's an Athena-looking type figure. There's some graceful woman, perhaps the wife of Leonidas, welcoming envoys from afar. I don't know if there's a specific location. Actually, maybe you should write into me and tell me also whether you think this is a particular place or just kind of an idyllic netherworld, like the setting of Raphael's School of Athens, which is my favorite painting ever. So it's very cool to be here amid these sort of glorious, evocative images. I wish you could see the whole room because it's got a ton of awesome stuff in it. But anyway, let me know where you think I am. I will let you know on Tuesday. But for now, let us do another episode of Words, Words, Words. If you're just joining us for the first time, this is our Friday series about translation. And you can write into me at rejoiceevermore.substack.com and let me know anything you've always wanted to know but been too scared to ask about how translation works, how to pick a good translation if you're reading a great work that's not in the original, that's been translated out of Greek or Latin. Obviously, I think you should go to the Ancient Language Institute and pick up these languages for yourself so that you can get a hands-on experience of the Western canon and the great works therein. But failing that, if you're going to be reading stuff in English and you want to know how to pick a good translation, we've been doing a bunch of different episodes on what are the sorts of things that translators have to think about so that when you're reading a translation, you can be thinking about those things too and hopefully get something that's really going to work for you and for your purposes. And that has sort of broadened us out in this wonderful way into thinking about how language in general works. Because one of the things I've realized through talking to you guys and through hearing your questions is that there's all sorts of stuff that I do kind of on the daily when I'm translating, for instance, the Odyssey out of Greek, that is incredibly cool. The process of translation reveals all this awesome stuff about how language works and what language is. But if you're just doing it regularly, you don't necessarily think about it so much. It's just like if you were, a gardener or a plumber, you wouldn't probably think too much about the nuts and bolts. It would just be an obvious part of your day job. You guys have helped me to realize that there's a lot of stuff in the transition from language to language that is extraordinarily profound and has a lot to say about our situation, our nature as human beings, and the human condition. So I have a great question today from Jess that gets at exactly this. Jess is an online friend of mine who has become an IRL friend as well. She helped with my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. She is herself both a wonderfully insightful thinker, just in terms of religious matters and sort of more broader issues, but also she's a science teacher, and so she was really helpful as I was trying to think about the history of science, how science works, and her question touches on that in a linguistic way, about the language we use for science. So she writes in, why do words that were once scientific in nature, once adopted for common use, fail to describe the thing they were once used for. For instance, the idea that a tomato is actually a fruit and not a vegetable, or that a pumpkin is a berry, whereas blackberries and raspberries are not. I feel like there's some linguistic thread to pull on here, but I can't quite seem to grasp it. All right, I love this question for a bunch of reasons. First of all, it enables me to quote my favorite bumper sticker, which goes something like this. Knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit. Wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. And I think this is kind of what Jess is getting at, that there's a disconnect between the technical language we use to parse and categorize the world in our most precise way. There's a difference between that and then the normal everyday speech that we use, which has a little bit more fuzziness in it, a little bit more looseness, so that if you insist pedantically on scientific accuracy in the language of everyday speech, you're going to end up making stupid mistakes that actually aren't smart, that don't lead you into greater precision, but lead you to do things like put tomatoes in fruit salad. And everybody knows that's gross. And so obviously there's something in the word fruit, the way that we casually use it in everyday speech, that doesn't include tomatoes, even though technically the scientific definition of a fruit does include tomatoes. And so what we want to think about here is what's that transition that we're making. It's almost like a kind of translation from scientific speech to casual everyday speech. How does that work, and what does it tell us about our understanding and our language? There's a wonderful passage in Aristotle, in the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle discusses this question of specificity. And one of the things he says that I think we could really stand to recover, that we aren't as good at remembering this anymore. One of the things he says is that the degree of specificity of any study or discipline should be matched to the subject that's being studied. So if you are talking about abstract absolutes and first principles, things like numbers and concepts like the good or justice in themselves, absolutely, or even the soul, then you need to be exactly precise because, for instance, 1 is 1 and it's not 1.001 and it's not 1.2, it's 1 exactly. And we're able to nail down in more abstract philosophical language or even technical scientific language precise distinctions between this and that. And we can draw really clear, sharp lines. But in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle is talking about the science or the study of human action and what's right and wrong to do, and that's going to lead him ultimately into the study of politics and especially of prudence. Given difficult choices, given bad options, how do we make the right choice among a series of subpar, less than ideal options and scenarios? And we are very familiar with this kind of situation right now because we're, 3 days away from a presidential election in which basically everybody is dissatisfied with some version of the choices. There's some degree of dissatisfaction for everybody with the choices that we're facing in this presidential election. And so Aristotle would say, yes, this is a domain, politics, the domain of human ethics and human life and human politics. This is a domain where things are inherently fuzzy, where you don't get perfect, clear-cut choices that have an obvious answer that you can work out with an equation, but you get trade-offs and you get fuzzy difficulties that you have to kind of weigh one bad option against another bad option, and you just have to pick ultimately the choice that you think is going to be the best of the available possibilities. And this is called prudence. And this is why Aristotle thinks that if you try to get more specific about questions that have inherent fuzziness around the edges, inherent uncertainty, like human life, where we always never quite know what we're going to face in the future, when there's inherent uncertainty, trying to nail down or specify your language and your thought more than the situation warrants is actually going to end you up in a worse place than if you allow for the ambiguities and the gray areas where they genuinely exist. And I think this is a major problem that a lot of people are facing right now with this election, and they've been facing really since Donald Trump descended the escalator, that everybody's categories have been scrambled. Everybody is faced with trade-offs and difficult choices that force them maybe to compromise on some of their ideals and beliefs. And a lot of people just want to nope out of that. That is, they want to not vote, or they want to vote for some third-party candidate, and they want to kind of avoid the necessity of making a choice between one of two options. And I think this is an example of thinking too specifically and with too much pedantic rigor in an area that just requires you to allow for a little bit of fuzziness. It's not that your principles aren't real and true. It's that your principles occupy a space where you can be really precise and clear. You can be in the abstract really precise and clear about right and wrong. You can perform moral reasoning at a very high level before it starts to move into the sphere of real life and real history. But then when you actually have to make choices, you are confronted with, you don't get the ideal possible option that's sort of contrasted with the worst possible option. You get a bunch of grays and browns and fuzziness, and you have to translate your high abstract principles into some definite choice within the world as it actually exists, which is a world of compromise and fuzziness and difficulty and uncertainty about the future. And so this is an example, I think, of the kind of problem that we're dealing with. At the very high level, we're dealing with the translation of high abstract ideals into the reality of messy life and some of the things that get lost and changed along the way. Now, that's in politics. What about in science? Jess is asking about scientific language and how it can be translated into everyday speech and how that translation can sort of go awry. So you used the fruit example. I think that's a great one. There's a technical scientific definition of a fruit that includes tomatoes, but there's also a casual working definition that is less clearly specified of a fruit that doesn't really include tomatoes. When we say, I want a fruit salad or I want to eat some fruit, we typically don't mean I want a tomato. And if you brought a tomato to somebody that had asked for a fruit, they would probably be confused, even though they would well know. I mean, we all know that a tomato counts as a fruit. Here's another lesser known example, but I think it's even more fun and kind of interesting when you start to think about these language questions. Most of the things that we call nuts are not actually nuts. Cashews are a great example. You probably didn't know this. Cashews are not nuts. We call them cashew nuts. We include them in nut mixes. I have a can of nuts at home in my pantry with a bunch of different kinds, and cashews are 100% included in our working definition of nuts, but they are in fact drupes, which is an even better word, and it leads us into thinking about all the different kinds of things that we call nuts that are technically, according to the most precise definition we have available, not nuts. So a tree nut, in the most exact definition of the word, is a shelled pod containing a single edible kernel. I promise this has to do with fruits and with Donald Trump and with the election. So a single nut is a single pod with one kernel inside. So a great example of this would be hazelnuts. Hazelnuts really are honest-to-goodness nuts, okay? But there are two other categories that are important here when we start to think about what we typically call nuts. One of them is drupes, which I've already mentioned, and that is a pit or a stone, sort of like the pit of a peach. A peach pit is a drupe, okay? And there are a lot of different fruits that have these kind of inner stones, and it matters from a scientific perspective, it matters kind of what you're looking at, what kind of tree or plant you're dealing with. And a cashew grows on the end of, we never see these, and it's kind of hilarious to think about it, but the cashews grow on the end of a cashew apple. That is, they are the seed of a different kind of plant, and that makes them a drupe. Which is a word that I'm just going to say as many times as I have the opportunity to on this podcast. Then there are legumes, which we know best as beans, basically. These are edible seeds inside of seed pods, but you have multiple seeds in one pod. So that's a legume, also not a nut. What that means, shockingly, is that peanuts are also not nuts, because peanuts are legumes. They are multiple seeds inside of one pod. So if you insisted upon this scientific categorization, then most of the things in my canister of mixed nuts back home are not nuts. They're drupes, they're legumes. There are a few, as it were, true nuts sitting around. These include chestnuts, hazelnuts, pecans, or pecans, or pecans, or however you say that. Those are all real nuts. But everybody knows when I say, like, do you want some mixed nuts at a party? Everybody knows that it's not going to be restricted to chestnuts, hazelnuts, and pecans, and that it will include walnuts, but it won't include coconuts, and it will include cashews, right? So there's this weird, like, Venn diagram overlap of a million different things that technically in the scientific language are not all nuts, but within the giant umbrella of my English word nuts that I use regularly, these are all nuts, right? Now, ironically, the scientific language is often derived from the everyday speech language because we come up with our words for things not in a laboratory and not in a classroom, but in just the natural exigencies of the words we need to describe our everyday experience. So things like fruits, nuts, right? These kinds of big category words, and you could include, cats, dogs, trees, all of these sort of species words. They first emerge as ways of describing a kind of entity that you experience in the world. And you notice a certain degree of similarity for instance, in the kind of crunchy things that you can get out of plants that aren't meat, but have a certain degree of like substance, edible substance to them. That's basically, I think, what we mean when we talk about nuts. Similarly with fruits, we typically mean like a sweet product of the vegetable world that you can eat without too much preparation and that grows out of the ground or out of some sort of plant. We don't mean these really precise hair-splitting definitions that I've been referring to in science. When we go away and we do science, then we are trying as best as possible to categorize at a physical level what's going on. And this tells you, I think, something really important, which is that the words you use and the way you define your language depends on the object of your attention. It's what you're paying attention to that defines the way you carve up the world into language. And speaking very generally, ordinary language is designed to map onto the way that the world looks to somebody paying attention to it in a normal, everyday way. So when I move through the world and I talk using my everyday language, I'm describing things as they appear to me in the everyday world. For instance, when I still say that the sun rises and sets, right? And people have been saying that forever. We now know that the Earth moves around the sun and not the other way around, but we still talk in our everyday speech as if the sun moves around the Earth because that is the way that it looks to us. And for the purposes of our experience, that's a more accurate way of describing what's going on. For the purposes of science, where we want to get under the hood, as it were, and know the trajectories of things and perhaps even control the way that things grow and are produced and are changed, for the purposes of science, it's actually not helpful to talk about the way that things appear to us, but to try to get beyond that appearance. Now, in my book, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, I write a lot about how ultimately we can never get behind human consciousness. There's no such thing as getting away from or beyond the perception and experience of the world. But there is such a thing as paying attention to different elements of our experience. And that's what happens when we change our language from regular everyday language to scientific language. It's sort of like shifting the focus on a camera lens. And I've used this metaphor before for the change from demonology into psychology. So in the ancient world, people talk about demons all the time. Now we talk about psychological states and conditions. And I think we're talking about the same set of phenomena, but we're reorienting the focus on our camera lens so that some things come into focus and some things come out of focus. In scientific language, what comes into focus is the material principles, that is, the material tendencies that are always linked to one another in a chain of cause and effect. Because what we're trying to focus in on is the simplest possible patterns that we can observe so that we can use those patterns to predict, say, where Saturn is going to be in the sky, or how to grow agriculture in such a way as to like feed more people. And when you're thinking about what kind of plant food do I need to offer this tree, it might matter very much whether you're dealing with a drupe or a nut or a legume or whatever, because you need to know exactly the formula for, how I'm going to put this thing in the ground to grow, which part of this tree needs to go in the ground in order to grow, right? At that point, it becomes very important, the distinction between drupes and nuts and fruits and all of this other stuff. You need to know where the fertile part of the plant is and all of that, because you're trying now to access and to focus on the production side of the world. That is, how do we get into the guts of the world and rearrange them to our purposes and to our liking. And there's a lot of good in that. There's also a lot of potential evil, which I think we've seen at great length in the last several years, which I talk about more in my book. But the key is, right, that the focus of our attention has changed. And some things come into sharper focus, such as which part of this plant would I need to put into the ground in order to cause it to grow, right? But by sharpening that focus in that area, we've actually lost focus in another area, which is the area of normal everyday human experience. So by tightening the aperture, by zeroing in on a particular element of what makes a nut from a biological standpoint, I've actually lost focus on the way that I, as a person eating mixed nuts or eating fruits or eating fruit salad, the way that I would actually experience certain similarities between things that maybe aren't genetically or biologically identical. So there's more similarity between a watermelon and a coconut than there is between a watermelon and a tomato from the perspective of flavors, right? Which flavors go together, how I'm going to encounter them in the world. And that means that these two kinds of lexica, these two systems of language, are like overlapping lenses that capture some things and leave other things out. And the reason this is so important, and not just a point of academic interest for people like us who like to think about language, the reason this is so important is because when we transition from science into everyday life, we have to understand what kind of material we're dealing with, and we currently don't. If you remember the COVID era, if you remember when Dr. Fauci was saying that the science has these rules for us about how we should do politics, about how we should decide, or, which cities to lock down and when, about, what kind of economic routine or plan we should care most about, that's an attempt to take scientific modes of thought, scientific language and ways of thinking, and map them onto the much fuzzier and more complex world of human action and decision-making. But the problem is that many of the factors that would rightly affect our decisions in politics and in ethics and in human action are not the factors that scientific language and thought is equipped to focus in on. So you can talk at a very granular, specific level about the material tendencies in, say, agriculture using scientific language. You can't so much talk about the taste of a fruit salad. And if you're asking what should I serve at my party that will make my guests most joyous and happy, and you're dealing in questions of like human life and human enjoyment, human desires, even human ethics, then the categories you need to think with are more in the line of like flavor and enjoyment and taste and experience than they are in the line of, say, genetic makeup and the sorts of things that you would need to manipulate to make things grow. You might use science in the service of making a tastier cantaloupe, but when you move into the realm of like serving food at your party, you actually have to refer to human beings and how they tend to experience the world generally and the kinds of things that matter to them and are good for them. Just in the same way, when you move into politics, it's not actually time to think about like formulas and equations for predicting, maximizing economic growth, or at least that kind of thought can only be in service of higher questions like what's ethically good here? What's morally right? Given the options on the table, how should we proceed as a nation? And those are the sorts of questions that don't require scientific categories, or at least only need scientific categories on the way to thinking about much larger categories like justice, like virtue, like the good in itself, like what is a human being and why should we care and what's best for humans living individually and together. So actually this weird little question about fruits and nuts and fruit salad opens up this whole avenue, I think, of insight into what's wrong with contemporary thought. Like, why is it that we keep defaulting, glitching back to equation-style thinking, when what we really need to be doing is reasoning morally and speaking in plain and direct terms derived from our everyday experience of the world and our intuitive knowledge of right and wrong, right? Why are we so allergic to making reference to categories like right and wrong? Why do we shy away from simply saying, I know this is wrong because it is on its face clearly grotesque, right? Why do we instead have to cite studies? I mean, I always find it really funny when somebody comes out with a social science study that says something like, we've now been able to get hard data that shows that using your phone 23 hours a day is bad for your brain. And I think, like, okay, maybe there are some people out there that need like a statistical regression analysis in order to make that clear to them. But I'm not one of them because I've got a phone, and every time I take the thing out of my pocket, I can feel the way that it sort of drains my attention and my vitality and my soul. And I know that I need to set up certain ethical boundaries around it. I don't need a study to tell me about that. It might be interesting, and it might perhaps clarify exactly how we can address the problem best, but I don't need the study in order to justify my intuitive, direct, experiential knowledge of the fact that this thing is bad for me. Or, they'll come out with some neuroscience brain scan, and they'll say, like, we've showed that the part of your brain that lights up when you feel pleasure is like the same as the part of your brain that lights up when you achieve a goal or something like that. They'll tell you materially, physically, and therefore scientifically where certain things sit within the pattern of your neurons. And they'll often cite these studies as if they prove that this experience is real, as if we need material language and evidence from a study in order to show us that, oh, I don't know, people get depressed after a breakup or something. And sometimes you can understand that phenomenon better with reference to science, but you don't actually need science or scientific language in order to believe in that phenomenon because you have that experience. You are the authority on your experience of the world, and you actually don't need a scientist to prove to you that you are having it. What you need science for is to understand better where in the physical world this spiritual experience you're having meets its analog. We are embodied souls. Every spiritual experience, every emotional experience we have also has an analog in the material. And we can shift the focus of our language in order to bring one or the other of those two things into focus. But to suggest that we can only know something if it's expressible in these material scientific terms is actually a category error. It's making that mistake that Aristotle warns us against, where we want to talk about human things in using categories and using language that is way too precise and specific and subdivided in order to really grasp the reality of human experience on the ground. Don't let anybody talk you out of the reality of your actual experience. That is actually the root of all language. And even scientific language is actually parasitic on the basic realities of what people have been doing for all of human time, which is talking to one another about the experience of the soul. Everything comes out of that, and anytime we do a translation, even if it's within one language from scientific to non-scientific language, our touchstone, our ultimate baseline of truth is that pathema tes psyches that Aristotle talks about, that inner experience of life and the soul, which we are giving form to in language. And always, when we're translating, we're referring back first and foremost to that ground of reality that is human experience. Okay, this was a great question. Thank you, Jess. I welcome more questions always at rejoiceevermore.substack.com. You can DM me. You can send me an email, however you want to do it. The book that I mentioned earlier is up on Amazon, Light of the Mind, Light of the World, Illuminating Science Through Faith. If this sort of stuff interests you, then I think this book would be a real joyride for you. It's, I think, a really fun history of science dating back to the ancient world and all the way up to modern quantum physics, making the argument that science has not disproven God or gotten rid of the necessity of theology, but in fact, it may be the case that we need our ancient theology and scriptures to make sense of what science is currently discovering. Thank you so much to everybody that's bought the book so far. If you've liked it and enjoyed it, I would really appreciate a 5-star review on Amazon. That's the easiest way to do me a solid right here, right now, is just to rate the book 5 stars, because that really increases the visibility. And of course, the show as well. Spread the word, let people know, text your group chat. I hope you appreciate the opportunity to talk in the midst of a giant election, the opportunity to talk about translation and language, because it brings me great joy. It spark joy, as Marie Kondo might say. So thank you for that. Thanks for being with me on this journey, and I will see you next time for more truth, beauty, and the stuff that matters.